Thanks, everyone, for joining me at the Horses Advocate podcast. This is Doc T. I have a very different type of podcast for you. Most of the time, I give you a lot of detailed information at a cellular level to describe what equine metabolic syndrome is in a horse and how we can alleviate that. But I thought this time I would frame it a little bit differently. I am going to talk about horses in the end. I am going to talk about metabolic syndrome and why so many horses are affected by it, but I'm going to take it from a historical perspective. So in other words, it's one thing to say, oh, you're feeding too much sugar, or they're not getting enough protein, or they're not getting enough exercise, or they're, behind a fence, or, whatever I've said in the past. And I know a lot of you have listened and understand that. And if you haven't listened to some of the old podcasts, go ahead and get in there and listen to them. But a couple of things have happened this week that make this a little bit more enjoyable. So here I go. I'm going to start right now. First of all, I have in front of me a book called A Tropical Frontier, The Cow Hunters by Tim Robinson. And this book was given to me by the author's wife because it has a historical perspective. It's been given the Patrick D. Smith Award in 2015 for Florida Historical Society. And just reading from the back, it says, the Florida Prairie, 1860, cattle country. War looms, but to the settlers living along a jungled tropical creek, it all seems very far away. For Becky Hackensaw, there are much more pressing matters, such as providing an education for her 6 children. So I read that because, number one, it's a gift. Number two, it talked about life here, right where I'm living in South Florida, near Fort Pierce, and what it was like in 1860. It goes back a little bit further, talks about some stuff in the 1840s, but it's still a very good historical perspective on what it was like to have horses and to work cattle and to just live. And I decided to read it, and I can't put the book down. I read it every morning a little bit more before I scoot out the door to go to work. And what I really like about it is the way the author describes life in real words that create, in my mind, live pictures of what's going on. And what's even more important is I can recognize some of the towns. I can recognize the Nelson camp, because you can still go to the Nelson camp. It's in Jonathan Dickinson State Park outside of Jupiter. I've actually visited the camp after canoeing out there many years ago. And when you experience it and then somebody guides you through it, it makes you understand that life has occurred on this earth for a long time. And it's hard to grab hold of that in today's society where we're moving so fast. We have this computer, I'm recording it, I'm going to edit it, I'm going to upload it. It's going to be on the podcast tomorrow morning. And that really does blow my mind. I have a wrist watch that rings when the phone rings. We have so many things going on in our lives. It's hard to look back and say, gosh, we didn't have electricity. We didn't have fans. We didn't have screens for our windows to keep the mosquitoes out. We had heat. It was called cutting the logs and putting the logs on the fire, and then putting the kettle filled with water on the fire, and then carrying the kettle with hot water and pouring it into a bathtub, which had colder water that was drawn from the well that was hand dug, maybe 5-6 feet down into the ground, and then lined with planks to make sure that it didn't cave in. That's where you dipped your bucket into to grab water, and then finally take a bath, which you did basically once a week. And if there's several of you in the family, in this case, they would draw a number, and whoever won the highest number, or the lowest, or whatever, took the bath first. And then when they were done, they would add more hot water, and the second person would take the bath in the same water. And it would go on down the line, the third and fourth. And it was done outside here in Florida. And then when it was all done, then the tub was dumped. And we don't think about that kind of stuff. And it really started me to think about how fast we've made progress since 1860. So 1860 to 1960 to 2023 is 163 years, if my math is correct. And that seems like a long time. Nobody knows anybody who's 100 years old, yet just this past week or two, we buried my father-in-law, my wife's father, who is 95. And 95 seems really old. And it is well beyond the average age of humans. And you're listening to this and you're maybe 70 years old, maybe you're 50, maybe you're 30, maybe you're just turning 18 this year. And our ability to think about what it was like 95 or 100 years ago or 160 years ago it's required to have a great imagination or to do your due diligence and dig in and understand the past and really understand the past. And unfortunately, and this is the only political statement I'm going to make, there's a lot of twists and turns in history that have been not really represented well. As I listen to some people who actually tell me what politicians did in the 40s, whether Stalin, Mussolini, or FDR, the president of the United States, or Mao Zedong in China, or other leaders of countries, and how they manipulated and got their people to live and prosper in their certain countries. And that's the only political thing I want to say. The only point I want to say is each group of people has been led in different factions, whether it's a democracy or dictatorship or an absolute tyrannical dictatorship. They all have prospered and moved on and still exist today. And I look at our horses who have survived 55 million years, and then about 5,000 years ago, give or take, depends on who you read, they were captured by humans and made to do what humans wanted. And it's basically to move things, including our bodies, around the countryside. So when I read The Tropical Frontier, the cow hunters, they've been riding horses since the beginning of time. They grew up on the backs of horses, and the horses did what they needed. They would go through the scrub brush. They would get the cattle out. They would round them up and drive them to market. And they went through some pretty dangerous spots that had cottonmouth water moccasins and diamondback rattlers and alligators and bobcats. And many of them were sacrificed in this job for all the trials that we had here in Florida. And of course, they had working dogs. Dogs were essential to the life of a Florida, what they call a cow hunter, or what we now call cowboys. And my mind started to really settle on this as I drove around, and I started to think a lot about it. Then I was lucky in the past 3 or 4 or 5 days to have experienced 3 separate things that really amazed me. The first was Thursday afternoon. I drove through the Bronx. Now, we've all heard of the Bronx, New York. We know it's a suburb. It's one of the boroughs of New York City. There's Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx. And the Bronx, of course, if you're a baseball fan, know that's where the New York Yankees played, the Bronx Bombers. And there's a lot of history there. And it was a Thursday afternoon, and the weather was absolutely gorgeous. The traffic was bumper to bumper. There were scooters scooting, often with two people on them, weaving in and out of traffic, not obeying red lights, and just having their way. There were double-length buses that were articulated, so they look more like a train trying to get through all the city streets, and they took no prisoners. There were vendors on the streets selling everything from baseball caps to fresh squeezed juice and lots of really good food. Don't know who grew it, don't know where it came from, but it was sitting out in crates for people to buy. And there were tens of thousands of people that I passed in that hour and a half that it took for me to drive through there. We basically crept through. The Cross Bronx Expressway was pretty much shut down, and I was trying to get to the George Washington Bridge to get out of New York. Well, what a dichotomy, or a juxtaposition, or what a stark difference between the settlers of South Florida, who only had themselves and nobody else around, who when they had something delivered for them at the general store would raise a flag, and the farm would be 3 miles away from the general store, and they'd look over every morning. If they saw the flag, they knew that they had to get on their horses and ride a full day over to the coast and pick up what they needed and then bring it back. Now it's like, yeah, I'm going to fly over to the other town. Yeah, it's an hour drive over, an hour drive back. And I'm bringing the truck so I can load up all the stuff, my hay, my shavings, whatever, my stall supplies. Or better yet, we just call somebody and they deliver it to us. But the men on the prairie didn't have that. But on the other extreme, the people of Bronx had no concept of life other than human. They did have these fresh fruits and vegetables for sale, but I'll bet you if you ask them, nobody would know how they were grown, if in fact growth was even on their mind. Maybe they think they're made in a factory. I don't know. I've heard that story. But I didn't see a shred of grass, with the exception of the botanical gardens, which of course is an oasis in the middle of this asphalt jungle. But it was just such a stark difference. And then I was at a farm way up in the hills of Virginia with beautiful views of just mountains with further mountains and further mountains, each one diminishing in clarity and color into a faint gray. There were no other people around. The farms are few. In between, it was a sanctuary for people who had been living in the city to move away and now experience life way out in the middle of nowhere. But were they in the middle of nowhere? They had full internet. They had cable. They had fiber, full speed fiber, Wi-Fi in the barn, with nothing else around them. And you guys know I'm a big Tesla fan. There's not a farm out there right now that can't get internet. All they have to do is get Starlink, put the satellite dish on their roof, and they're going to have incredibly high-speed internet that's reliable even through rainstorms. And if you live in the north, it's heated, so it'll melt the snow off the satellite dish, so you'll never have a blocked signal. And this dish actually moves to line themselves with the satellites, so you never get a lost signal. So nowadays, we have cell towers that reach in almost every corner of the world. We have fiber in the most remote spots. We certainly have electricity, whether it's solar or generated somehow, or you're on the grid. We have all that. We have delivery of our food, of a food for our horses. We have at the beck and call, usually someone to come out there to help us, either with the farrier work, or in my case, the dental work, or veterinary work. Although that's getting harder and harder to find out in the rural areas, as there are fewer and fewer equine veterinarians. I've had a whole podcast on that called Houston, We Have a Problem. So Yeah, that's gonna be a problem for a lot of us out in the rural areas finding a good veterinarian. Um, so then I went to see a client I hadn't seen in years, mainly because Melissa had been taking care of her, and she'd lost her husband, so life kinda got in the way, so I was coming back to take care of her older horse, and I've always liked this, lady. She's 2 years older, she's born 1951, that makes her, 72 years old, and she decided to tell me some of her story from the beginning, mainly because I'd spurred her on from, my Bronx visit and this book I'm reading, and she says, "Well, when she was 8 years old, she was moved by her parents out of San Francisco way up into the woods, and her father was a forester who looked for forest fires and things like that. Well, at 8 years old, there's nothing there. There's no car because the dad had the car, the only car they had, and he always took it to work, and he'd be gone for sometimes over a week as he looked for forest fires or he fought forest fires. There are no roads, there's old stagecoach lines. It was an old gold mining town, and they had a well. That's how they got their water, and this is in the late '50s, and she's 8 years old. She wakes up one day, and her front lawn is covered with about 30 horses, and she thought her prayers had been answered. This is the best thing that ever happened to her, and she went right outside, and she closed the gate and claimed all the horses as hers. Typical eight-year-old, right? And she ended up, meeting the next door neighbor rancher that they'd never met before, and of course, he claimed his horses back, but he liked her and took her over to his place and gave her a pony called Firecracker, and I hope I'm giving this story, if she's listening to this, I hope I'm giving good, color to her story, because I was just enthralled as she told it to me. So here she has Firecracker. She's never ridden a horse. The rancher says, "Oh, the pony's fine." The parents are there not knowing anything about horses. And she gets on the pony and she walk off and go around the corner where nobody's watching. That's where she dug her heels in. And the pony took off at a gallop and went down to ravines, across creeks and up hills and did everything it could, and that girl and that pony became one. They were absolutely connected forever, and they came back, and the rancher said, "Well, how was it?" She says, "I love this pony," and was her first true love, if you will. And a year later, at 9 years old, she looks at the Christmas tree that her parents have, and it's not looking so good. So she decides to go out and she finds this nice pine tree out in the woods and chops it down and brings it back to the house. But of course, she didn't think that far ahead. How do you bring a Christmas tree that she says was about 8 feet tall? And because they had to cut it down to get in the house. So she knew it was about 8 feet tall. She didn't bring anything to bring it back with, and she's on this, pony bareback with just a bridle. So, she gets over a rock, a big rock, and she climbs up on it, and she hoists the tree up over her right shoulder, and then she mounts her pony who stands there, and the pony and she go riding off to home, and they can't take the old stagecoach trails because they're all overgrown, so they have to go out in the main paved road, and drivers would stop and just exclaim, "We saw a pony in a tree going down the road." They didn't even see the rider. And finally, she made it to her house, and her dad came out, and he was very proud of her and called Ma to come out and take a look at the sight that he sees. And they had a Christmas tree, and she was 9 years old. As this woman tells this story to the classroom, which are high school students, she tells these stories to them, just try to get them to understand what life was like. And the biggest comment she gets from this story is, "My gosh, you were allowed to have a hatchet?" And I don't know about you, but gosh, we had a hatchet I used and took everywhere. I chopped everything I could. I mean, a hatchet and I would sharpen it, go out there. I mean, yeah, that's what we kids did. We had lots of hatchets around. But kids these days don't even know what a hatchet is, or they think it's a weapon used to throw at people and split their skulls open. So here's a gal in 1958 to 1960 who is, let's see, let's just say 1960 to 61. She's living where there's a well. I think there might be some electricity. I don't know if there's a phone. Her pony slipped and fell and landed on her, broke her foot. And she had to wait until the afternoon when a neighbor came by, and it was the neighbor that helped take her to the hospital. That's what you did. You didn't call for an ambulance and a helicopter comes and lands in the next paddock over and hauls you off to one of the regional hospitals. It just didn't happen back then. Now, again, this is 1960, which is 63 years ago, which is certainly within my lifetime, maybe not within your lifetime, but it's certainly within the lifetime of somebody you know. And it's not that long ago. They had outhouses. They didn't have indoor plumbing. You had to leave your house, go outside, and in the cold, in the dark, find the latrine. And then did you have rolls of soft toilet paper? No, you didn't. You either didn't use toilet paper or you used pages out of the what they call the Sears catalog. I mean, that's what people did. There was no other choice. And my point that I'm trying to make to you is when it comes to nutrition for our horses or the care of our horses, we are so blessed. As I sit in a stall working, I've got bedding, it's clean. I've got fans blowing to keep the flies off, several fans in lots of stalls, electricity to power it, electricity for lights, electricity for a water pump. I just turn the faucet, out comes water. And there's a good solid roof over our head, which is really great, but that's not the way it is everywhere. I go to some places where the roof is leaking. There is no power. I was just worked in a barn yesterday where they have no fans. I was sweating horribly, and so was the horse inside the stall, and it was dirty and dark. And I tried to wash the smell off my boots because the manure had been packed in there for so long. So we still have a range of things, but they were still buying hay. Everyone's buying hay. But hay wasn't made back in 1960 on a regular basis. Yes, there were some tractors and there were baling machines, but not everybody had it. If you wanted hay, you were cutting it still by hand and putting it in the barn by horse all the way through the 40s and into the 50s. So we're talking 70, 80 years ago. And remember, in 1960, when my client was a little girl carrying a Christmas tree over her shoulder by pony, after chopping it down herself, we didn't have any interstates. It wasn't until President Eisenhower came along and declared that we needed a way to get our military around the country fast. So he started building these interstates, and that's where it came from, 1960. So I lived down here in South Florida in 1972 to 73. And the interstate I-95 didn't come all the way down. It kind of stopped in Jacksonville. And then there was a section built north of Fort Pierce, but from Fort Pierce down, there wasn't anything until you went down to Palm Beach because Martin County wouldn't allow the interstate to be paved through their county. These are real stories. And we are in such a flux of technology where I was talking to a gal today. How old was she? Early 20s. I think she said 23. And she said when she was born, there was no iPhone. And when she talks to people younger than her, they are completely different than she is because she didn't have an iPhone where she could record everything or play games or arcade games or do anything. It just was basically, send an email. I mean, a text message, maybe. That was it. And of course, I come from the time where I carried stacks of quarters and yes, even dimes. And I knew where all the public payphones were. And as I did my rounds, I would go around and find a payphone and put my dimes in, or nickels or whatever. I did have one that still took a nickel, believe it or not, for a phone call. And I was outraged that it jumped up to a quarter. But I would call in and say, do I have any messages? Do I have any farms to go to, any emergencies? I'd be checking in all the time. There were no radio telephones that were effective in mountainous areas, and there certainly were no cell phones. And I had one of the first cell phones ever, as a cellular one cell phone. And it was actually, it's before that, I had a radio telephone in 1985 where I pushed to talk. It was a party line. So I make sure nobody's on it. I push the talk and say, Ithaca, no, I know what it was. It was a rotary dial, and I would dial it inside my truck and it would connect, but anybody on the party line could pick up and listen. So, and then we moved up to cell phones, and the charges on cell phones were outrageous. I mean, I'd spent about $1,400, $1,200 to $1,400 per month just to make sure that the phones would work. It was just outrageous. So technology is advanced a lot, and horses haven't, and horses' metabolism hasn't. And we get confused because the people who teach us, they probably are still young as well. They might be 30 years old who are teaching you. And the person who taught the 30-year-old might be a 45-year-old. But you have to start finding people who are 65 and older to find out exactly what it was like to feed horses and how sick or unsick they were. When I think about all the diseases that are in horses now that were not in the textbooks in the 1980s when I went to Cornell Vet School, it blows my mind. I had two farms declare that they had colics the same week, and they were both nephrosplenic ligament entrapments. I said, isn't that funny? We didn't have that in our textbooks. Didn't exist. Yet you don't need anything fancy diagnostically. Just reach in there and you can feel these. And I'll never forget the first one I sent to Cornell, and the resident who felt it said, oh my gosh, I think we've got one of these new nephrosplenic ligament entrapments. And we just anesthetized the horse and rolled it and got it back up, and it unhooked itself. This is long before we found a way to shrink the spleen. But we didn't need surgery. I cleared a lot of those out in the field just with some anesthesia and rolling them correctly. We didn't have kissing spine. We didn't have dropped fetlocks. We didn't have fractured cheek teeth. We didn't have the EOTRH, or the incisor teeth that get ugly and fall out. There are so many diseases that didn't exist back then. And now I'm coming out with a horse's advocate in these podcasts and trying to teach everybody, yes, there is a way we can get the horses back to the way they have evolved to eat. And we can get away from metabolic syndrome. And I was just given permission from someone who sent me a really amazing email. And I'm going to try and get the pictures put up there. Probably won't for this because I'm just that far behind. Here we go. So she had a horse that she got 16 months ago in his mid-20s, and had an ACTH that was in the 300s, which is very high, which means that he has Cushing's disease. He's flabby, quote, flabby and shriveled and hairy. He was full of sand. And he's on pergolide to manage his PPID, which is pars pituitary intermediate dysfunction. But it wasn't working on him at all. They weaned him off the pergolide, and she put him on an herbal supplement. And that eventually brought his ACTH down to 25, which was pretty impressive. But then she found my podcast, and she found that I've been preaching about soybean meal being a replacement for the lack of protein in horses' diets, and to get rid of protein deficiency. She got the ACTH down to 16. And she rides a horse, putting well over 100 miles a month on him in mountains and on flats. Let's see, what else does she say? He's doing amazing, and it feels good to know that he no longer has PPID. We cured it, and that is a gorgeous thing. And his EOTRH has become calmed down. It doesn't seem to be bothering the horse. And the pictures that she sent was this just unthrifty looking horse with a no top line, a big belly because the abdominal muscles were gone, the hair that hadn't shed out, although I don't know what time of year this was, and the hair coat looked very unthrifty. And then she sent a picture of the horse recently with a top line and shiny and doing really well. Especially in overall, he's feeling good enough to do 100 miles a month, which is pretty good for a 25-year-old. We all would like to have that. And I have a horse in my backyard who was a foster. So it was rescued by a veterinarian, and we took it off the veterinarian's hands to foster it. And since September, you can't tell the difference between these two horses. You wouldn't believe that they were the same horse. The hooves look great. The hair coat looks great. The skin conditions have pretty much all resolved. Although this year's still a little touchy because it takes 2 years of protein replacement before skin conditions will start to resolve 2 full summers. It's not until the 3rd summer that things are really good. But the whole essence of this podcast is we have to go back because evolution does not move at the pace of technology. You know, I've always said McDonald's doesn't make you fat. It's driving to and from McDonald's that makes you fat. It's not the metabolic syndrome being caused by horses that are being overworked or underworked. It's just they're being overfed. They're being overfed because everyone believes that every horse out there needs grain. And I keep hearing from people, oh my gosh, how am I supposed to get my horse through the event that it's got? Or how am I supposed to make sure he doesn't lose weight in the winter? And that people are so afraid, instead of stopping for a moment, taking a breath, and then learning what the digestive tract of a horse is supposed to do and what they're supposed to eat, and really identify the limitations of what's being imposed on these horses. In other words, they're not running through the woods, suddenly appearing at a little girl's front lawn with no fencing. That's just not how horses were kept. They were kept free to roam and have access to all sorts of plants, which had all sorts of amino acids. So I guess I'm going to wrap this up. I just want to take you through a little history lesson of how fast technology is going and how slow evolution is going. And evolution is having a very tough time with technology. The technology of the availability of food, basically. That's the technology that the horses and humans are having trouble with obesity so bad in both humans and in horses, and all the metabolic syndromes that go along with that, the mental disorders and the physical disorders. It's time we all just stopped and said, okay, I understand that I want to do the best for my horses. I get it. But I want to do the best for my horses on their terms, not on my terms, because I am not smarter than the thousands of years of evolution that these horses have gone through. I am not smarter. I don't care if you've gone to Cornell Vet School, we're not that smart. We think we are. And we certainly succumb to the noise, just like in the political debates between all those countries, from democracies to tyrannical communist countries. We are all submitting to the noise that comes out that says they're the truth. And I'm just, as a horseman, I'm getting tired of it. To open up the horse magazine or any magazine and read articles that are misleading, to read advertisements that are vague, and at best they're vague, and spout their efficacy when they in reality have zero efficacy or zero proof of it. All I'm saying is, when it comes to your horse, it's time that we honor their systems and not be afraid. And we need to step up and feed them the way they evolved to be fed. and get rid of metabolic syndrome and get these horses healthy so they can live long lives that are not fraught with lameness or illnesses. And I think it's all here. We can all do it. And while it doesn't earn a lot of profit for a lot of people, it puts money back in your pocket. Whether you're on that side of the fence or, on the earning side or the spending side, we have to think of it from the horse's point of view. And the horses that are suffering from gastric ulcers or colonic ulcers, who are living lives of misery, who are living in filth. Nobody's putting the effort into cleaning and maintaining and well ventilating, especially in the heat of summer, or making sure that they don't have the ice cold winds blowing directly on them in winter. So they don't have the ability to find shelter. They're counting on you to give the shelter. And we have to start treating these horses in a better way. And that's what the Horses Advocate's all about. And that's why you're here, hopefully listening to this podcast. And I've gone on and on long enough. So for my trips from the middle of the Bronx to the middle of nowhere, we have to start connecting with horses on their terms. And that's what the Horses Advocate's all about. And that's why I'm so grateful that you've joined me here at the Horses Advocate podcast. And I'm going to wrap it up. I think next week I'm going to come back with 2 more chapters from my book, Since the Days of the Romans. And I hope you're enjoying that so you can understand what's going on in my life and where I'm coming from and why I want to help horses thrive in a human world. So thanks for spending your time here. And this is Doc T. I'll see you next time. Bye. Hey, everyone. Doc T here. Thank you for listening to my content. Would you do me a huge favor? Would you please subscribe, comment, like, thumbs up, and give a star review? However it's presented to you, I want you to do that. There's 2 reasons. The first, of course, is to improve this product. This way I know what you like, what you don't like, what I can improve upon, what topics you want me to cover. But more importantly, it's also going to help others find me. And by doing that, you are now engaged in this mission of helping horses thrive in a human world. By you helping, we can reach others. And that I would be so grateful for. And remember, go to thehorsesadvocate.com for updates on this information. Thehorsesadvocate.com. And again, thank you so much for being here. Doc T out.